The community college I most recently attended offered a course on the 60s, but even though I enrolled, it didn't have a sufficient enrollment um, to go. So in that, the students weren't interested. I don't think it's easy to make students interested in the 60s. Part of the reason might have been that it was advertised in the Dayglow psychedelic lettering that was popular, associated with men like Peter Max, who I had the um, happenstance to become acquainted with at a small gallery in Pittsburgh where he visited. Um, Peter Max, as you may or may not know, was doing art for things like Yellow Submarine by the Beatles, which is still popular and advertised in the Russian press today, this day and age. Well, the 60s can mean many things to different people. Um, there was not general agreement about what was right and what was wrong in the 60s, and that's what led to the um, issue of rights being in conflict that give rise to a lot of the argumentation about the meaning of the 60s. I think it might be more possible to show what I remember through compare contrast ideas and synthesis ideas. One of the things that needs to be compared and contrasted is what the meaning in the mainstream of black culture was then, as opposed to what it may have been in the 20s and what it might have been in the 21st century 20s, now 100 years after the Harlem Renaissance. In the 60s, black culture was engrossed in the civil rights movement, which was passionately led by Martin Luther King, Bob Moses, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, um, Fannie Lou Hamer, Harry Belafonte, and Reverend Ralph Abernathy, a close friend of Martin Luther King, who I had the good fortune to march hand in hand with through the Great Hall of Cathedral of Learning as, the Pitt Student Union. When he reached out to take my hand, he had a marvelous, beautiful grip. And it took me by surprise, but he wanted to hold my hand and march with me several strides down the Great Hall. I still remember that. He traveled with Martin Luther King to the Nobel Peace Prize. But I don't mean to um, associate myself with the meaning of these great men. It was in the 80s when he came to Pitt. The civil rights movement was largely over. But the civil rights movement, if you don't know, you can get the basics from the Montgomery story. It began in Montgomery, Alabama. King and his socialite wife decided to go south, taking her from her desire to be a career singer into the heart of the movement in the poor sections of the segregated South, Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma. And of course, many of these issues have been lionized now, made into movies, which have the problems of Hollywood attached to them. I personally have been brutally victimized by Martin Sheen, who plays the judge of the bridge in Selma. Hollywood's a very different thing to grapple with. It had violence, vampires, scare stuff, and egotistical actors and actresses. Those days, the one person who was in Hollywood, Harry Belafonte, was unimpeachable, a close, beautiful friend of Martin Luther King. But aside from the sit-ins and the bus boycotts, they often say now that Martin Luther King was more radical than is always noted, that he wanted greater reform, and immediately. I've often wondered what would have been said if he had been alive when the Berlin Wall came down. Some the rue. But there's another picture. It's often not noted that the division existed in the NAACP, that things were not harmonious towards Martin Luther King. True, it was lighthearted. Adam Clayton Powell would make fun of King when they were alone together. But although they loved each other, it was deeply divided ideologically. There were people who considered him opposing and setting back the welfare of his people by calling out Lyndon Johnson on the Vietnam War. We still have that pain running as a thread, a hot wire through our culture. When I speak of synthesis, I think it would be interesting to compare and contrast the radical King with the souvenir King. But it would also be interesting to compare and contrast the views inside the NAACP about Martin Luther King and his goals in the movement. But I believe also that you can learn a great deal from synthesis. There was actually a person who was really the one civil rights movement leader at Woodstock. I saw him play at the now gone Syria Mosque in Pittsburgh. His name was Richie Havens. And he was just the man you see at Woodstock, immersed in the movement, playing for freedom. A beautiful human being. When he played at the Syria Mosque, he came out, his fingers somewhat bandaged from the incredible performance he had just given. He took time to sign autographs and say hello to everybody who wanted to say hello to him, in the way Roberto Clemente would. In fact, Roberto Clemente was somewhat on the outs with some of the pirates because of the way that he would mingle with the poor fans and the children, rather than, you know, clubby up in the dugouts in the club room with the other prima donnas. He loved to go to the barrios and play stick and stone baseball with the poor. The 60s had about it a message of hope that people could come through the dividing lines, and that amends could be made for the past by learning about and understanding each other. And of course, although it's not popular to say so, there were great strides forward. We now know a great deal about things in the mainstream of public education, which would be the high schools, public high schools in cities like Chicago and Atlanta, and the community colleges, about people who were once completely invisible, like Zora Neale Hurston of the Harlem Renaissance. Richard Wright, of course, was recognized by people who studied African American literature. But to what extent were the people who were lesser known, like Conte Cullen, the poet, Langston Hughes, um, W.B. Du Bois poetry, Smoke King. I'm the Smoke King, I am black. Beautiful poetry. Known outside of the mainstream, out of the Ivy League intellectual class. So when you look at the civil rights movement and the way that it moves fluidly through the 60s, and you see things like the newsreels of the Chicago demonstration after Bobby Kennedy was done in, when there were protests and police riots against demonstrators, peaceful demonstrators being beaten over the war in Vietnam. You realize that the Vietnam War was a tremendous obstruction to racial progress in America. Sad, sad era. It's easy to see why people would be scared of it and avoid it, especially when you see the blinker lights of the kaleidoscopic psychedelic movement that came down. It gets very hard to take after a while. But be that as it may, we still have people who lived for the epiphanies of the times. People who are still very responsive to the music and lyrics of Jimi Hendrix. Some people might, I'm from Pittsburgh, but I was transferred, which is in police studies, worse fate than termination, to Seattle, where many people would argue that Jimi Hendrix was part of the 60s peace movement. I believe that's true. I believe that there's always been some tension between the peace movement and the civil rights movement because, in part, a lot of racial progress was made by dutiful bearing of burdens and with brothers in arms. But to use that to make an argument that war is therefore good is what King argued against, and the peace movement argued against. But they also embellished things with a degree of reckless abandon that differentiates Jimi Hendrix, who was a martyr to reckless abandon, or poison crime, to which he was made vulnerable by the era of reckless abandonment, compared to the thoughtful, statesman-like, brotherly love of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. When I say that the situation in the arts and in the plastic universe of Hollywood hardwired around the meaning of the 60s, it's because I know that it was superimposed on me. I don't like to bring in, the ideas of the 60s to what happened to me. Because when I wrote anti-apartheid articles, which were sincere and from the heart, they were very persuasive articles. I was said to be interfering. Why? Because they were planning to tell a story about me. I was interfering by asserting my personality, by asserting my agency, by not sitting still and being what they said I was. And they fought to cover for how I was tortured. Not even the civil rights movement caught on and said, no, we don't want this one. So it's sad for me, but it doesn't take away from the learning and joy that I experienced hearing about Martin Luther King. Of course, suffering in silence was part of the burden of my hostage as a child. And I was just a child when I was attacked and tortured for the first time. But that doesn't qualify because so many different things get wrangled up in the new age of understanding these issues. For example, Ralph Abernathy in the 80s actually endorsed Ronald Reagan for president because he thought we would heal. And of course, he was called out on that by some people. Jesse Jackson couldn't believe he was real. But how do that be different from today? Somebody saying we should negotiate with Vladimir Putin. It wouldn't be that much different. It's the heart of light trying to reach through the mania of personality called politics and say, let's work together and try to resolve these problems rather than keep up the friction. And that's what Ralph Abernathy believed the answer was. He was a relatively simple man. I personally didn't agree that you could just simply discard Ronald Reagan's chauvinism, brutality, and callousness. I was a terrible and still remain a terrified, absolutely terrified victim of the Reagan's callousness. But it came from a partnership with the people who led the psychedelic era. People like Ringo Starr make me sit bolt upright in bed with my hair on end. They're so frightening to me from their cruelty. Their cruelty is almost undescribable. And yet, these were the people who said that I was somehow an agent of counterintelligence about these divine heroes. The 80s were a very strange time. The 90s were a very strange time. I have done my homework and done my blog work and tried to put together what I think happened and leave it to history to work out the compare, contrast, synthesis, and difference of opinions. I've heard some people argue very pointedly against some of the things that I believe. Well, that's life. That's life in a democratic society. But to actually torture somebody because you disagree with them is scary as a development in the United States. And it's happening in Seattle and Pittsburgh. That I can't really relate to. When I reached out my hand to Ralph Abernathy, instinctively, enthusiastically, excitedly, and surprised, it was because I loved him. It wasn't, I didn't even think about it, nor did I go seeking it. It was his initiative. Nobody would believe that. I barely talk about it because I know that nobody would ever believe it. They would say you were trying to sneak into the stage and insinuate yourself to the great hero so you could play all big. Had nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing to do with it. So, I mean, I understand, but I also don't understand. I think that's the bottom line when it comes to my dispute with the Seattle Civics. I don't understand where they're coming from. I don't see how they can do what they've done, and I don't see how they can think the way they think. And I get the message that no matter how brutally I was tortured, no matter how severe the health consequences were. I mean, I have this book called Twitch Hell, Letters to Gail, which anybody who knows about the Gail Burst and Paul McCartney situation realizes must have been part of their psychotic index. I don't understand. I don't understand how they can do that. I don't want to try to make sense of it. I know that it comes from authoritarians in the psychedelic movement. You know, people who think that there's an alien radar connecting us to the Pachintelli Lama transcendent and eternal or something. And that, like Gurdjieff says, pain is of no consequence. It's a learning issue. I don't understand how they can do it, how they can justify it. It's not within my realm of comprehension. And because of that, I think I'm special and I'm an odd man out. And then anybody who wants to kick me is entitled to do it in the minds of Seattle and Pittsburgh. That's the way they see it. I was just a deaf library clerk. Can you imagine how compromised that would be to be a deaf part-time library clerk for a living? You can't raise a family. You have to go through the rubber stamp of a secret illegal union cult to have a girlfriend. I mean, and I was just saying, I accept this as my lot because that's just how it played out. And then dump a whole bunch of other stuff on me that I'm supposed to answer ad infinitum forever. It's just it's berserk. It's saying that I was to blame for hot cars and stuff. I was kidnapped in hot cars. We had to get the hell out of there. But it looked like random street crime. Now it turns out it was all sort of organized by methodologists and stuff. I mean, administration needs to settle down because they're the only ones who can solve those kinds of problems by monitoring. I know that you don't need to tell me that there aren't hugely talented, much more promising, much more professional, much more capable achievers and overachievers in the Black community. People who are invisible. I'm not talking just about Cory Booker. Cory Booker, I'm sorry if you feel slighted by my um, miscue, but Booker Washington himself was a very perceptive man for all of his flaws. He was an underrated intellectual who accomplished a great deal. There's a lot of people who are underrated who have achieved a great deal more than is celebrated. And there's a lot of fighting over recognition. It's based on what nobody ever told me that there was this thing called Tony Gramsci's war for position. It's open mic bullies, in other words. A lot of people are unsung heroes. You don't have to tell me that the Black community has brilliant, dedicated, thoroughly canonized superheroes who are just ordinary human beings. I had a woman come here and bring me something I needed when the COVID lockdown happened. She didn't know me from anything. She wanted to. She heard my situation next door. And she didn't ask anything in return. I mean, it's just a casual act of heroism by an elderly African American woman. It's unforgettable to me. See, part of the problem is in the deaf community, people do make fun of each other and stuff. But deafness is the tie that bonds, not race. I mean, there are people in the Black deaf community who pick up on the hyperbole of Black action and channel it into the deaf community. But most of the people in the deaf community get raised together in a colony of deaf people where the deafness is the transcended fact and the virtually unconscious of race. There are some culturated racists as well in the deaf community. I don't mean to undercut that truth when I say that the people who primarily stick together and stay together in the deaf community are people who are the tie that bonds is that they're deaf. The black white stuff is completely secondary, even invisible, and needs to be explained to them for them to understand it. So I know that's true. I mean, I'm sure there are people who come and say, no, that is not true, but it is. I know it. I've seen it. I've interacted with it. I've had enculturation processes with it. I'm not hugely culturally competent when it comes to the deaf community, but I am now acquainted enough that I can pass classes with sign language and so forth and have friends, lasting spiritual familiars who are deaf, both Black, Korean, white, and professional workers with the deaf. Now, there are things that happen in the background with invisible minority issues that go on behind the scenes negotiating their um, privilege, as my Latin American professor would say, from the sidelines, the way Roberto Clemente was a peripheral minority figure because he was from Puerto Rico, or the Filipino American veterans not being able to bring their wives to the United States, who were deaf people being invisible, you know, Korean deaf people being invisible. Those substrata statuses, but consciousness about them owes a lot to the civil rights movement. The loquaciousness about them, the ability to articulate and make meaningful statements about these substrata owes a great deal to the civil rights movement. It's popular to people to grind the axe about victim status and various historic wrongs. And that's what the 60s came to in the 90s. The push harder than the other people struggle that um, characterizes our politics today. But I think that when people treat one another as human beings first, you can bypass that most of the time. You know, um, I think sometimes it can be dishonest. It's dishonest to say that I don't love black people. I love to see them happy. It's just dishonest. But I know that that dishonesty um, has a pitch to it that's um, powerful because of the um, food chain issues that are involved in rivalries for ethnic dominance and so on. And of course, there's imperial factors all the time. You know, the psychedelic movement leaders were imperial factors, and even though they're evasive of that fact, it's true. You know, I mean, um, Hollywood management of celebrity icons and personality cults become very conflicted with the idea. The media becomes a sounding board for tag teams and atrocious mismanagement of issues and political conduct. That's some of which has never really been seen before. Yeah, it's frightening, you know. So I don't expect to be vindicated in the mind of someone who says it doesn't matter if you love black people. Black people have no reason whatsoever to love you. So, and you'd be just as well to hate them. Now, I don't agree with that. You know, black people don't love me. That's life. You know, but you're talking about a situation where there's a dishonesty factor in all of that. It's the unbearable dishonesty. Like when you get from, I think that's one of the main reasons why people didn't take the class, the unbearable dishonesty. The free speech movement is a good example. The Harris stuff, you know, the, you know, I'm a cancel culture and word, um, Mama Haggy. You know, remember that song that was sung by a man named Hud? Went through the free speech movement. Yeah, and it you can't um, it's too touch sensitive to even be allowed to be aware of. You know, I mean, I love that song. I could sing it easily off the top of my head. I could sing it easily. It's beautiful. Whatever. It was a troubled and difficult period. And I think that when you want to understand it, one of the best places to start is Richie Havens. really is. I'll show you.